every once in a while, we'd get in trouble and not know what to do. Our machine would go down. And so we would call for Frank Oppenheimer. It turns out Frank was there 24 hours a day. And if anybody had any trouble, why, they'd call Frank. He'd show up immediately. And he'd ask us, well, what's your problem? And we'd tell him, well, heck, if we knew what the problem was, we'd have fixed it. But he'd go over to the machine and twiddle with it a little while, and then he'd get us back on the air, and he'd get going. After a while, I was transferred from this experimental lab to the spectrographic laboratory. At LSU, I had worked in spectroscopy and had done a thesis in spectroscopy. After a while in this spec lab, my brother Paul arrived. He'd graduated from LSU, and so he and I were working together in the same spec lab. He had received a Navy commission while he was at Oak Ridge, but they disallowed him accepting it, so he stayed there. I kind of got moved on eventually. The room in which the spec lab operated had a phosgene problem, and we wore masks on our belt so that whenever some phosgene odor was, when we smelled it, we put on our gas mask and continued doing whatever we were doing. It turned out that the air intake for that particular room was next to an exhaust from a lab that on occasion produced phosgene gas as a byproduct of their operation. So we just carried our mask and went on. Late in the summer of '44, housing was found for dependents. And we took an apartment on West Eller Drive. Bob Hill, also in the Navy, had the other apartment. Bob came to Los Alamos. I don't know whether it was at the same time I did or at another time. But anyway, he became head of engineering. And then we were later to live across the street from him on 45th. Paul and I, while we were in the spec lab, became friends with the British delegation. And it was later when my brother Paul was working for US Rubber, and he was living in London and had, he was working for Phillips Petroleum, excuse me. And he was in charge of all the European operations for Phillips. And at one time, he was the chief negotiator for all of the North Sea gas that was being sold. Well, after working in the spec lab for a while, well, before that, the first uranium-235 that was produced was a small quantity, and Paul and I had been asked to do the spectrographic analysis, which we did. And it was a short time after that somebody wanted a water-cooled vacuum X-ray spectrograph. Well, I'd never heard of an X-ray spectrograph. But anyway, we were assigned to design, build, and operate such a gizmo. We brought welding equipment, a lathe, various other tools, and we did the research and designed the spectrograph. Jack I drew it all up as we went along, and Jack, who was working with me, followed the construction of the water-cooled glass X-ray tube in our glass shop, and I built the rest of the setup. We got through, put it all together. It worked on the first try, much to our surprise. Then it was a short time after that that I had my last assignment at Oak Ridge. I was called to the office of Colonel K.D. Nichols, who was in charge of all the operations at Oak Ridge. He was a deputy to Groves and later chairman of the AEC. Anyway, someone had lost some of the first uranium-235 that had been produced, and they thought it was in a specific laboratory. And he put me in charge of finding the stuff if it was there. And he also assigned a couple of other Navy ensigns to work with me. We went down to the lab, and I looked around, and I sent one man to the labor pool to get get everybody that was waiting to be assigned for a job, and sent the other man to the warehouse to get a box full of hacksaw blades and hacksaws. And as the workers showed up, why, it was a room that was about this wide and maybe once again as long, and it had floor to ceiling metal piping, in which there were several rows of this piping, and this was the processing lab that they thought the uranium-235 was lost in. Well, anyway, I just gave each guy a hacksaw and a bunch of blades and told him to cut from ceiling to floor all the piping in about lengths like so. And they started out doing that. Well, it wasn't but a few minutes before all the Union stewards showed up. You can't do that sort of thing, they told me. Well, and they tried to pull all their guys off of the job, and I told them in no uncertain terms that this was the highest priority job at Oak Ridge at that particular point in time, and that they better not pull anybody off the job without the consent of K.D. Nichols. And they went away, and they never came back. So we continued cutting it down and leaching it, and we took the piping downstairs to where we had leaching vats, and we leached all the piping, and we found nothing, not a thing. Later in Colonel Nichols' book, he gives 2 or 3 sentences to that problem, and he said it was thought to have been a bookkeeping error. But anyway, we tore down an extremely expensive lab. In March of '45, Y-12 became operational, and the Navy was no longer needed. Lieutenant Commander Norris Bradbury and a Dr. Brode came to Oak Ridge from Los Alamos to recruit Navy workers. Norris interviewed me and recruited me for the destination team. Well, I knew what was going on, and so, yeah, I accepted. And we were to report as soon as possible. And I left Serena again, this time with our 1-year-old son, Larry. In late March, I took a train to Lemay, and as I got out down there at the depot, I looked across the street, and in the fence row there was a white cow skull with long horns in the fence row. And I began to wonder, what in the world have I gotten into here? I took a limo to Santa Fe, and Dorothy McKibben met me, and she was expecting me, and she called a taxi, and the taxi took me up to Los Alamos. I was taken to the Manhattan Engineering headquarters, given a security briefing, a badge, and assigned to a bed in the BOQ. Next morning, I reported to Fussell and Stevenson. Fussell was the group leader of the XUnit design group. They sent me down the hall where people were building the first XUnit breadboard prototype. We spent that day, that night, the next day in the room. We were brought our meals. We could go down the hall to the bathroom. And if we got too tired to work, we cleaned off a bench top and sacked out for a while. After we finished, the breadboard prototype was shipped to Raytheon for the Mod 1 build. The XUnit was weighed about 300 pounds. It was about so big around and so deep. The components for the XUnit were mounted on a 1/2-inch metal plate about 3 feet in diameter. A deep-drawn aluminum tub about 12 inches deep covered the contents. And when bolted to the base plate, when the cover was bolted to the base plate, it gave you the opportunity of controlling the relative humidity inside with the components. The Mod 1 arrived back at Los Alamos. A few modifications were made, and the unit returned to Raytheon for the Mod 2 build. Since the size and weight of the XUnit was very awkward to handle, I was asked to design 2 handling fixtures, one small and one large, so that we could work with this thing. The small one, they were both A-frame construction with wheels, and at the apex of the A-frame on the small one, I had a bolt with an arm that I could tilt, and when you tilted when your cover was off of the base plate, and the base plate with its contents placed on these arms, they could be bolted on both sides so that we could tilt the contents back and forth, and also it was on wheels, we could roll it around and do whatever. And the large A-frame was for us to, after it was ready to mount to the weapon, it had a steel band that would go around the unit, and it would bolt to cinch it so it would tighten up, and then we could lift it up and position it onto the weapon and bolt it in place. It was many years later that Serena and I were visiting our daughter Sue Caudell at the 82nd Training Group in Shepherd Air Force Base in Texas. And she toured us through all of her various facilities. And when we got to the nuclear training class, up in front of the class was my large A-frame. And it had a few modifications. In size, it was exactly the same, and it did exactly the same thing I had designed it for. But it was of polished stainless steel, heavy tubing, and with an electric chain hoist. And my original design was black angle iron with a hand chain hoist. But anyway, I was greatly surprised to see that. Shortly after my work in the building of the first XUnit, I began making weekly trips almost to Wendover, Utah, where the 509th was based. And other people from Los Alamos went with me, and also some of our SEDs. SED was Special Engineering Detachment. And these were pretty sharp guys. And but on the plane going up to Wendover, they would change from their uniform to civilian clothes, because when they got to Wendover, they'd be instructing and in charge of some of their people who would be officers, and you couldn't have that. So they would change clothes going and coming home. And when we were leaving Los Alamos, we couldn't tell people where we were going, and when we got to Wendover, we couldn't tell them where we had come from. So everything was really quite secret. Maybe not quite as secret as at Oak Ridge, because at Oak Ridge, the secrecy was really pretty severe. When we took the 509th sent down planes to carry us back to Wendover, and then they'd also had a plane to take us back to Albuquerque. But we'd take off from west to east down here at Albuquerque, and the plane would be very heavily loaded, and it would drop down below the west edge of the field on takeoff and wouldn't recover field level until we out over the Rio Grande. And it was a spectacular flight up the Rio Grande, and one of the pilots always wanted to fly water level up the Grand Canyon. Well, we didn't much want that, and we were able to persuade him otherwise. And it was many years later, taking off west or east, a 509th B-29 with weapon and other components took off to the east, and it clobbered into the mountains on the east side of the runway there. It didn't gain enough altitude and all killed. And I was down and helped pick up some of the pieces. Some of our stuff was on board. At Wendover, we disassembled the XUnit, inspected, tested the components, reassembled, pressurized, and mounted on the weapon. And once we'd done this, then the weapon would be transported to a pit where it would be loaded onto a B-29. And then they would subsequently take off and make some sort of a training flight. Most of the times they would drop weapons. Drop the bomb at the Salton Sea, but there were other drops also. I and another guy had built the weaponeer's control box and the two weapon and the cabling to the weapon. the control box checked certain in-flight responses, like we would charge and discharge the XUnit capacitors and other functions. Now, when you think about it, you've got a 5-ton HE ball out there, and you're charging and discharging the XUnit, the capacitors of the XUnit, and if something goes wrong, you may not be long in the sky. But for some reason, I didn't think of it in those terms back then. But anyway, nothing happened. I flew 3 training missions as weaponeer. And before takeoff, the tail gunner and I would crawl back through a long tube tunnel over the weapon in the bomb bay back to the tail gunner's quarter in the tail of the plane. And after we reached 8,000 feet, I'd crawl back through the tunnel and take up my position at the compartment just behind the pilot to do the weaponeer job. I flew 2 missions for drops to the Salton Sea. Observers there checked the bomb as it dropped and subsequently hit or missed the target. On the 3rd mission, I saw the Golden Gate Bridge through the bombardier's scope at 30,000 feet. And because we had they didn't make the drop, we had the bomb still in the plane. We flew around until they got low on gas, and then they landed back at Wendover. And that was the first time they'd ever landed a weapon, but no nuclear, at an air base. They'd always made drops. So that was one of the first. And it happens years and years later that I was on a carrier out in the middle of the Atlantic, and we were there to watch the operation of bringing a Navy plane with an externally carried weapon back on board for the first time ever. And as the plane sat on the deck with the externally carried weapon, the tail fin was only about 6 inches above the deck. And when it landed, I expected to see all kinds of sparks, but that didn't happen. It landed perfectly safely. And we said, okay, I guess that's all right. So afterwards, they started landing back with their weapons when they had not used them. And we were supposed to be brought back by the carrier to the U.S., but he came on the air and he says, hey, we got a problem in the Mediterranean, and you're welcome to spend the summer with us. But if you choose, we'll fly you off and back to the U.S. Well, we opted to fly back, but in this old bomb plane, seats had been fashioned, 4 or 5 seats had been bolted to each of the bomb bay doors. And so here you are, you're sitting and you're looking over here, and there's the seam of the bomb bay door, and you're wondering, boy, I wonder what's going to happen if that bomb bay door happens to open. But anyway, it didn't, and we got back safely. Once at Wendover, for some reason, I was asked to help calibrate some barometric switches at various altitude. And we went up and were taking, I'd come down an increment, and I'd take some measurements and some more. And I'd tell the pilot to go down another increment and so forth. And finally, I asked for another increment down, and the pilot came back and asked if I'd looked out the window. And he said if the wheels were down, we would have been landed 10 minutes ago. I opened the curtain and looked out, and yeah, we were almost at ground level. I was surprised that he'd fly that close to, we were over the Salton Sea. I mean, over the sea, over the salt flats west or east of Wendover. Once at Wendover, after breakfast, I got picked up by 4 or 5 security people. One was an FBI guy, and one was a project security, and one was a base security, and I don't know who the others were. But anyway, they wanted to know what I was doing getting a telephone call the night before. And I said, well, I didn't get any telephone call. What are you talking about? Well, they quizzed me for about 3 hours and finally let me go. But it turns out what had happened, I had been very neglectful in writing Serena and telling her where I was and what I was doing, which I really couldn't do. And so she had called up our group office, and somebody had given her this Wendover telephone number. And the call came through, and some guy answered it. He tried to find me and couldn't. So I didn't take the phone call. But anyway, I was finally saved from the security risk camp. The security people had a camp that was tucked away for such people that were security risk. So I missed that. I stayed at Wendover for usually a week. All the mail, if any, was sent back to Los Alamos for censoring and mailing, within a return address of 1663 Santa Fe. I ate my meals when in Los Alamos at Fuller Lodge. I have eaten at the same table with people like Klaus Fuchs, James Conant, Arthur Compton, General Groves, Ernest Lawrence, etc. One morning, General Groves was seated directly across the table from me, and he remembered me from Oak Ridge. We talked and talked. Everybody else had left the breakfast area. The servers wanted our table to clean it and reset it, and so he and I got up, walked outside, and we talked and talked some more. Later that day, General Groves issued a Manhattan-wide project order. All officers will report to work on time. Okay. Later in June of '45, I was informed that I would be a member of a 3-man team to go to Tinian to get our facilities ready. We got our shots, was told to tell no one. However, I was allowed to go back to Kansas City and tell Serena that I was going overseas, but I could not tell her where I was going or what I would be doing. When I got back, I approached my bosses, Fussell and Stevenson, and asked if I could put together a toolbox of things that I thought we would need to do our job on Tinian, just in case the tools and the implements that had been sent by boat never got there. At the shell loading plant in Charlotte, I had learned that things sometimes never reached where they were sent. And after a while, they allowed me okay. So I got me a big box, and wooden box and went down to the warehouse, put it on a dolly, and I went back and forth through the rows of the warehouse, and I just tossed in everything that I thought we would need to do our job. Tools and instruments, whatever. No packing, just in the box. And then I got the Green Hornets. Well, the Green Hornet was a transportation for Wendover, the 509th. I got the Green Hornet to take it to Tinian. And it turned out later that they were the only tools that we had to work with on Tinian. The original tools that were originally sent were found and showed up after VJ Day. And we couldn't bring them back, so they were just loaded with a lot of other equipment in an LST, and we took it out and dumped it in the ocean. But Ensign Barney OKeefe, Ensign Prose, and I were ready to leave, and as Captain Parsons had asked us to come by and see him on our way out, and he said that Oppie wanted to see us. So we went across to his office, and the secretary told the secretary who we were, and she said, yeah, he wants to see you, but he's in a meeting. But she got up and knocked on his door and went in and told him that we were there. And he came out immediately, and as he shook our hands, he said, we will not tolerate any mistakes. Goodbye. So we left. We took off a little later, went to Albuquerque and got a plane to Burbank. And when we landed at Burbank, there was a Navy plane sitting right next to where it parked it up to let us off. Captain Parsons had arranged for this Navy plane to take us down to San Diego so that we could go to the Navy base there and pick up our pay accounts and get on the road back to San Francisco for a flight further west. But when we got down to San Diego, it was fogged in, it was raining, and the Navy plane didn't have the navigation equipment to land under those conditions at this base. So he took us back to Burbank, and we got a hotel room, and next morning that night we flew back to San Diego in a commercial plane. And the next morning we took a taxi out to the Navy base, and we were walking down the street there, and we met a two-star admiral, and we failed to salute. Well, those of us that had been in service at Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, we never saluted anybody unless we saw somebody salute us. So we failed to salute the two-star. He got about 3 or 4 steps behind us, and he decided, well, that ain't right. So he came back and collared us, and he gave us a lesson in saluting senior officers, and told us that the only time that you didn't salute was when you was inside a building. Okay. Well, early the next morning, we were in the transportation office in the federal building of San Francisco. And we were standing in the entrance door, kind of trying to decide what to do next when another two-star entered. And since we'd been told you didn't salute inside, we didn't salute. Well, he didn't get very far. He stopped immediately, and he says, he gave us another lesson in saluting. And that inside the federal building in San Francisco, all officers were saluted. Okay. We finally got up to the lady who was going to take our travel orders at the transportation office. As she read our orders, She said it'd be weeks, maybe months before we can get you out. We have too many already ahead of you. And by this time, she'd gotten down far enough, and she said, oops, just a minute. We have a plane out this afternoon. It turns out we had the highest travel priority of anybody in the Pacific. And we could go anywhere on our own recognizance, only we didn't know all that much, but that's the way it was. So later that afternoon, we were out at the airport, and we boarded an old commercial Pan Am Mars flying boat. And much to our surprise, Captain Parsons was also on the plane. The passengers were mostly nurses with 2 or 3 generals. The nurses were needed because of all the injured people that were back on the firing lines at Japan. And we flew all night, and at daylight we landed at Pearl Harbor, Honolulu. We got a BOQ for the day, and since it rained all day, and we decided not to do any sightseeing, and so we rested in the BOQ. Later that night, we caught a MATS C-54 about dark, flew all night to Johnson Island for a breakfast of black coffee, black beans, black bread, and some butter. And then when the plane was serviced, we took off for Kwajalein, and there were dozens of Japanese planes that lined the airstrip there, and out in the harbor it was full of planes of all, full of ships of all kinds, waiting for the invasion of Japan. After refueling, we took off for Guam. Arriving at Guam Airfield, we got a BOQ for the night. Next morning, Captain Parsons took us up with him to see Admiral Nimitz at his headquarters. Captain Parsons went in to see Admiral Nimitz, and we 3 ensigns were entertained by 3 Navy captains. One, the fleet gunnery officer, another who supplied all the bombing targets for the B-29 raids on Japan. And they quizzed us and tried very hard to find out what the heck we were there for, but we couldn't tell them. And so after a while, we got up to leave when Parsons came out of the Admiral's office. But while we were there talking with these guys, I heard a pop, and it turned out that some Japanese guy that had been left on the island was hungry, and he was foraging for something to eat, and he happened to be seen, and whenever this happened, they were shot just summarily right there. That afternoon, shortly after we came out from seeing Admiral Nimitz, we took off for Tinian, and we arrived by mid-afternoon. The 509th quarters were not finished. Our quarters were not finished, and we were billeted with the CBs. And the CBs were constructing our work quarters, and they'd also constructed the airfield, and they had really done an awful lot of work on that island. We arrived, as I said, at Tinian by mid-afternoon, and we were billeted with the Seabees. And the next day, Parsons had finished his meetings and he flew back to San Francisco. And then the next day, the Indy took off for Guam and subsequently headed on west, where, as you may or may not know, it was hit with a torpedo and it turned out to be the worst naval disaster in U.S. Marine history. Everybody was lost. General Groves was later to write that the Indianapolis was a poor choice to carry bomb parts because it had no underwater sound equipment for detecting submarines. One of the little boy team members had been a student of mine at LSU, Ted Pearlman. I don't know whether you've heard of him or not, but he'd been a student of mine at LSU, and I'd become friendly with him, and in my thesis I needed a drawing or some drawings, and I asked him to do them, and he did. Afterwards, when he came back from Tinian, he stayed at Los Alamos for a while, and then subsequently went down to Sandia, and then later transferred from there to Wendover, where he became the head of all engineering at Livermore, and that meant that he was in charge of all their weapon programs. On August 6, 45, after the guys had come back, wait a minute. On August 6, the Enola Gay with its crew and the little boy aboard departed for Hiroshima. It turned out to be a routine flight. On August 9th, 45, Boxcar with its crew and Fat Man took off for Kokura, Japan. And the mission was in trouble from the very start. They finally abandoned Kokura as a drop point and flew to Nagasaki, which was sacked in. And they finally found a hole and made the drop. But by this point in time, they were very low on gas, and the plane departed for Okinawa to refuel. And on landing at Okinawa, I was told that one or more engines failed after landing, and the plane was towed in for refueling. Later, after the Nagasaki Mission plane returned to Tinian from Okinawa, the Los Alamos people had a celebration party, and it turned out to be quite a party. After Nagasaki, we did not have a lot to do, and we were just sitting around in our assembly building, doing whatever, paying no attention to anything. And General Lemay with his entourage had entered the building, gotten clear down the middle of the building towards the back end without being recognized. And somebody happened to look up and see who it was, and everybody was called to attention. And so we all did. After VJ Day, the tools that I had sent, that had been sent first, showed up. As I mentioned, I think everything could not be used, so it was loaded on an LST and taken out to sea and dumped overboard. Since there wasn't much to do, I had gone Cory shell hunting but I could not find up enough of the graded sizes to make a necklace for Serena. And I traded with Lou Alvarez and Larry Johnson and to get some graded sizes. Back at Los Alamos, I went to an Indian jeweler here in Santa Fe and had him make me a necklace. And actually, I think Serena's wearing the Corey shell necklace today. I had a necklace and bracelet, and earrings made of the Coreys. Well, it turns out that I learned later that Lou Alvarez is credited with the thought of making detonators with bursting bridge wires to initiate PETN. Larry Johnson later received the patent for the exploding bridge wire that is used to initiate an explosive. They had both transferred out of the detonator work that they were doing in May and they wanted to go on the trip, and they joined the bang meter team. Rhoda was a small island off the southern tip of Tinian, and the Japanese had a garrison there. And with U.S. controlling the Marianas and the sea around, the Japanese could not resupply them. And if they got hungry enough, they'd swim across between the islands and get on Tinian and scavenge for food. And it wasn't uncommon if we hung our laundry up on overnight drying, that if you got up in the morning, you might find some pieces that you'd hung up not there anymore. But anyway, later on, the military brought in troops who were on R&R, and they lined them up clear across the south end of the island and marched them south to north. And if they flushed a Japanese, he was shot instantly. Shortly after VJ Day, we were transported back to the U.S. by a Green Hornet to Hamilton Air Force Base outside San Francisco. And we took a commercial back to Albuquerque and a taxi back up to Los Alamos. Back at Los Alamos, there was not a whole lot to do. There was a lot of confusion. I took 2 classes, one under Darrell Froman, who later became associate for oh my.
Norris Bradbury.
Huh?
Director.
Yeah.
Doris Bradbury.
Norris Bradbury, thank you, boy. That got to me again. Anyway, as I said, I took a class from Darrell in electronics and one in nuclear from Fermi. A little later on, General Grove showed up and presented the people with a letter of appreciation for a job well done. Sometime in there, I was sent down to Albuquerque, where some of the 509th planes were parked to make some measurements in the weaponeer space regarding some changes that were desired. The planes were supposed to have been guarded, but I could find no guard. So I climbed up in a 509th B-29 and went about my business. And next thing I knew, I was looking at a 45 in the face. As he came up through the bottom of the plane, Well, he trained his 45 on me. And I told him, look, you knucklehead, you're supposed to be guarding these planes. And you weren't. You were derelict in your duty. I'm here on business, and go away. Well, he went away. I did my whatever it was I was supposed to do, and that was that. Then even later than that, I was sent down to Sandia and to check out if I thought that the place might be suitable for some of the work at Los Alamos. My answer was yes. I said, yeah, engineering, but no nuclear. Sandia Base had been a flight training base earlier, and now the airfield was covered with airplanes by the, I don't know, I say hundreds, but there were a lot of airplanes parked out there waiting for something to be done with them. And later, the planes were removed and the buildings were used to house the start of what is present-day Sandia Base. I do not remember who sent me down or who I reported to afterwards. So, but it was a while later that the decision was made to send some of the engineering work down to Sandia Base. The 509th had been relocated to Roswell in New Mexico, and they continued conducting practice missions, but without Los Alamos weaponeers. On one of those missions, the plane disappeared from radar. The plane and all hands were lost, and no reason was ever found. I think I failed to mention that back on Tinian, Captain Parsons would not allow those of us that knew the full weapon story to fly as weaponeer. And so I and another guy had trained an Army radar officer to be weaponeer. I had written a check sheet and for him to use, and he'd made a practice mission or two before taking off for what turned out to be Nagasaki. The Pacific test was scheduled, first full-scale Pacific test was scheduled for the summer of 1946 in a test called Crossroads. I was asked to participate but declined. In December of 45, I made a request of Captain Parsons that I get out of service and go home. He allowed me a hardship case because Serena was on the farm then. We were going to farm for the rest of our lives and really needed some help. I left Los Alamos in December of 45 and took a train to Chicago. At Kansas City, Serena boarded the train at night, much to my surprise. And it turns out that Serena's dad knew the station master and had arranged for this to happen. We saw a lot of what gives faces in the sleeping car as we shared the same bunk to Chicago. We got to Chicago the next morning, went to the Naval Training Station and got my separation papers. I was to remain in the reserves for 10 more years before I got my honorable discharge. We took a train back to Kansas City and another train down to Centralia, and I began my civilian life. But it turns out that our stay in Missouri didn't work out as planned. So I returned to Los Alamos in December of 47, where I joined the Detonator group. A little later, our son Ben and Doug Venable's son were the last two boys born in the old Army hospital. End of story.
John, that was terrific. Thank you
Thank
for sharing that with us. We've got probably 30 minutes or so for questions
Okay.
and answers. I know everybody has many of them. Do we need to take a break? Let's take a break.
Okay.
All right, so we're back with John Tucker. We're going to have a question and answer session.
All right.
John, again, thank you for your time this afternoon. And again, I'm Alan Carr. I'm a historian at Los Alamos National Laboratory. I'm going to kick things off by first, very quickly, when did you retire from the laboratory?
I retired in 82. I came back in 47, retired in 82. But then at my retirement, the boss man for the Department of Energy, Albuquerque, came up and interviewed, he gave three of us a dinner and some plaques. And then after the ceremony was all over, he collared me and said, "Hey, would you be willing to do something for me?" So I said, "Yeah, if you get me rehired." So what he wanted me to do was to give one of my detonator seminars. I felt way back when that the people who made things for us didn't know enough about where their parts were going or even what the weapon was. And so I started giving a 3-day, very intense seminar in which I'd invite our contractors, some AEC people, military people, and there were some, turned out to be others, and bring them to Los Alamos, and we had this seminar. I gave Will a copy of the things we discussed in those 3 days, but we threw at them a lot of information. I knew that most of them wouldn't remember a lot, but they'd been exposed. But one of the things we did was take them downstairs to where the weapons had been, they were, all the weapons that Los Alamos had worked with were on display in partial disassembly. I don't know whether you know this or not, but there is a place down there where they are. And I would take the people through, I would tour them through all of these weapons and explain. And I got people from the W Division and even from the people upstairs to help with the various groups so they could explain what they were seeing. And it was a much appreciated course. And I hadn't given one for several years because, like today, I'd be going along in a presentation and all of a sudden, where am I?
I think you did pretty good. Those were known as Tucker Tech.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So how long did those continue at the laboratory after you retired?
Oh, well, they continued up to about 3 or 4 years before I retired. And because I was losing, like I said, I'd come up to a point and I'd be blank. And I'd have to ask somebody where we were. And once I found out, maybe I could go on. But it was embarrassing to me, it was embarrassing to the audience. And so I just quit doing it. But it was Mr. Romanowski, who was the manager of it was not AEC at the time, but DOE, of all the weapons programs at Albuquerque. And he asked me to do one of my seminars. I said, okay. And So I spent a year getting ready for it, and in early of, must have been 83, we had the class, and Will was one of my speakers, and then when that was over, I got a consulting contract, and I consulted for another 10 years. And it was during that time that one of the things I did was I wrote the Los Alamos detonator history.
Yes.
And so that's how I spent the next 10 years.
Well, I have a general question, then we're going to let everybody else get involved, and that's that, you were at the lab working in some capacity for the better part of 50 years.
Yeah.
You were there during World War II, the early Cold War years, as the Cold War developed, and really up until about the end of the Cold War
yes.
as well. How did the laboratory change during those years? What were your favorite moments? Were there frustrations?
Well, there was, and one time the president flew in, and there was a big delegation that met him, and he gave a little speech. I think it was the president, somebody, but people were practicing how they would leave the hill, without getting everything all tied up, trying to get off.
An evacuation.
They had evacuation practices, and things were just different. A lot of people don't remember that, and I just barely, but it was different.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to get some other folks involved, and so I'm going to open up the floor to other questions. John, why don't you look at me, even though you'll be answering others, since
Okay.
we're set up here with the camera,
All right.
so we'll get a good recording. But who wants to take the next question? Will? All right.
My name's Will Hemsing. I came to the lab in '74, and just continuing the discussion about the Tucker Tech, they were sometimes called detonator indoctrination classes. They were attended by new hire employees or other workers from the 3 labs or production facilities, and even the vendors sometimes. And I just wanted, thinking about the future and similar things, because I think it was really important for me, for my employment. Would John like to comment on the importance of those conferences? And I think they went on for decades.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, I'd asked Harold Agnew when he was director if I could have a class upstairs in the new building that had just been built, and he said no, and so I continued having it wherever I could find room. I had about 120 people in the class always, so I had to have a good-sized room, and I had them all over the lab wherever I could get a room. But finally, after Harold got gone, then I held this one in that room, and the room was swept for security reasons before we entered, swept afterwards. Our secretaries picked up all their notes and mailed them to them subsequently, so that everything was handled satisfactorily for the security people.
I'd just make a comment. I think those conferences were similar to APS conferences, except they provided a classified environment for participants to share and publish their work in the community.
I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
Oh, I think that what you did was a lot like what APS conferences were, American Physical Society conferences were, that were unclassified.
Oh,
These conferences promoted collaboration,
yeah.
ensured that knowledge was being passed down.
Oh,
Correct.
I had people from the weapons up where there I go. But I had top-notch people talk. And in my last one, Gene Eister, who was division leader of whatever group, whatever division we were calling ourselves in, he did the one for explosives. And it was people like that that I had talk.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, people like Eister and so many others that had decades of experience.
Yes.
Let's see, how about another question?
So I'm Keith Thomas. I'm from what is now W6, which is the current name for the detonator group at Los Alamos. And I've been there for 15 years or so, and prior to that did detonators and explosive stuff for the Air Force at Eglin. The report you wrote, the history of detonators, I want to ask some questions about that, because that's still mandatory reading for every detonator design engineer that I know, and we all use it, and it's used, on a very regular basis. As you probably could guess, we still do a lot of surveillance work looking at the systems we have, which are all referred to in that report, and so that report is pulled out on a regular basis, at least every week or two, to the data that's compiled, the history, everything is there for us doing surveillance on the stockpile at the moment.
Yep.
And it's just, just wanted to let you know that. But the question, to get to some of the questions I have, is sort of what prompted you to write that report, and you briefly mentioned it a minute ago. Could you elaborate some more on that? And
The detonator history?
yes.
Well, we had tried in the group to bring, I got to go back a little bit. When we got new engineers into the group, we had tried to get them acquainted with what went on in the group by writing what we called a catalog of the various objects that we provided the lab and the rest of the world, but it never worked. They just didn't know enough, and it just always collapsed. So I had done that. So up there someplace, there is a catalog.
Yep.
That.
Yes, there is.
But then after I finished that, I sat around and I wondered, well, what now? And somebody said, who was ever the group leader at the time, well, why don't you write a history? So that's when I was encouraged to write the history, and I don't remember who was group leader at the time.
About how long did it take you to do that? Do you remember?
Huh?
How long did it take
Oh,
you to
well,
do that?
I drug it out for 9 years.
It's not just another report. I mean, it's
No,
a
it is
real
not. It
history.
is
It's
the
a substantial volume.
the Bible of how to of all the Los Alamos detonators. That is for sure. And like I said, it's still mandatory reading, and all of us have read it many times. So there's a couple. I want to ask one more question, if I could. I'm particularly interested in slapper detonators and the history of that. And I found one of my favorite quotes you had in that report is at the very end of the chapter on the slapper detonator, particularly. And you say that there are many new and wonderful things were discovered on the way to weaponizing that detonator, but you just ran out of time. I forget the end of the quote, but it's like, you say that part, it's like, but I just had to stop. I was told I had to quit or something like that, so they told you just had to stop writing it, or or you had to stop at a certain date, or something like that? Or
Yeah. Well, I couldn't get too classified. I intended to write it unclassified, and actually I did the first chapter while we were living in Arvada, Colorado. And when I came down, I gave it to the security guys, and their hair went up. And they say, hey, you knucklehead, this is secret. And I said, look, I don't have anything in here that was classified when I retired. Oh, I said, oh, we've reclassified. So I tried to keep it confidential, and So I didn't take it as far as I could have in the history of the development of detonators because I would have had to be classified. I may have got up to slappers, I don't know.
You did. There's
Okay.
a chapter on slafters, and you talk about them. And actually, I was going to just sort of ask a general question along those lines. What do you remember or wanted to say about the first early days of the slapper detonator development? Were you part of that much, or mostly in EBWs, or?
Well, I really don't remember a lot about its characteristics or what it did, but apparently at that point in time it was thought to be a contender for detonator use, and in fact I don't know whether it is or not, but
Okay. I was more interested in the people that were working on it and some of those kind of things anyway. I mean, the characteristics I'm very familiar with, so.
yeah.
I'll let someone else ask questions now.
Someone else?
Oh, just kind of a comment. I talked to John a little bit, but when I first went to work for John, there was a detonator problem. And Les Hackenberry and I, who I share an office with, first job he gave us, sent us out to the storage sites, do some resistance measurements. And we found some problems. And my only question, I never did understand if they ever found the cause for this problem.
Oh yeah, we did.
Maybe classified, I don't know.
Do I dare mention why?
I don't think
Okay.
That was a no, Dad. That was a no.
That's all right, that's fine.
Yeah, well,
But you did find it.
yeah, we did find out the
That's all right.
cause,
That's fine.
and we had as a result, the entire stockpile was rebuilt.
Yeah, I knew that, but I just didn't know if the
Yeah.
cause was, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and that question was from Walt Wolf. Among many other things, Walt was the test director for a decade in the 1980s. I want to mention that just in case you said that I wouldn't get in trouble.
Yeah.
Just in case.
Thank you, yes.
Well, Walt, thanks for joining us as well, by the way. Any other questions?
Oh, I have one.
Who are you?
I'm Glenn McDonough. I started the lab in 1979. I retired a few years ago, but I still come back and deal with these people. But we have an interesting query from another government agency a few years ago about research done back in the 50s, 51 through 53, by Robert Rifle. And he worked on low voltage EBW detonators, very low voltage, down to like 10 volt EBW. And we researched this thoroughly, and we have asked everybody on the planet, but there's no reason why did they do this research. We have a lot of data and a lot of results, but there's absolutely no indication anywhere why would they spend 3 years trying to develop an EBW to operate at low voltage. And do you have any recollection whatsoever?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but in the early days, a spark gap detonator was actually, it actually had better simultaneity than bridge wire burst. And the spark initiated lead azide. And one of the first jobs I had coming back to the lab in '47, somebody was still keeping alive the thought of using a spark gap detonator for weapons. And I was given the job of looking at the problem. I went around the country. I knew a lot about lead azide from the shell looting plant, but I went around the country visiting various peoples and came back and I said, look, you do not want lead azide as an initiator on a nuclear weapon. And they finally gave up. And that's when we went to the bridge wire initiation. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Semi, it gives a few more hints. It's, you know, because the EBW development was well underway, but for some reason they went from the high voltage to spending 3 years to develop a low voltage EV.
That's right.
And there's there's no indication why did they do that.
Well, the reason the azide detonator, another reason, in addition to having better simultaneity, the firing unit could be about so big, weighing about 20 or 30 pounds, whereas the XUnit firing unit, that was a big thing, about 300 pounds. And from a weapon standpoint, the smaller unit was much desired. And and it had, like I said, better simultaneity. But I persuaded, I guess, enough people that that wasn't really a good idea for the things we were building.
Another question? You know, of those, I just, going back to my question from a while ago about how much the laboratory changed in all those decades. I mean, that must have been pretty remarkable to see. The laboratory going from a temporary military outpost to a permanent multidisciplinary institution, what we see today. You knew Norris Bradbury, Harold Agnew from way back in the early days. What did you think of folks like Norris and Harold, their leadership styles? And what do you think about the growth of the laboratory and during all those years?
Well, I guess I never thought a whole bunch about it. Somebody was wanting more weapons, and so that meant that we had to build more things, and as a result, I was busy. I didn't have much interplay with the rest of the community.
Right.
In fact, very few people at Los Alamos knew me. They knew less of what I did, because often back when Walt was with us, when we left on a trip, we couldn't tell people where we were going, couldn't tell them where we'd come from, and it was really a secret operation. And if Serena wanted to get a hold of me, she had to call the office, and they would get a hold of me. So through all of this, we did an awful lot of travel. The new air bases were being supplied with weapon assembly places close by, and we'd go and train those guys. In fact, I wrote the tech orders for the detonators for 30-some years. And so I would train military guys. I was at Sandia once with a bunch of military guys to help train them in what we were doing. And I let out a class for a few minutes, walked out in the hall, and the hall was just full of people, and I bumped into somebody, and I bumped into the Admiral Rickover. He was there on another class. So I tried to instruct the military and the people who did things for civilian-wise. And we made a lot of trips, what Walt was a part of.
I used my Goodland, Kansas address every place we checked in.
Will brought up the Palomares accident, and that was approximately 1962, or what year?
66.
66. Did you have anything particular?
I just remember that subject came up talking to John Tucker, and that he had been involved in taking care of all that.
Well, I don't know what you have reference to, but it turns out that the LA you see up on the mountain there, some people had gone up and rolled the rocks around and tore up the LA sign. And it turned out at that particular point in time, I was chairman of the high school PTA. And our youngest son, Ben, was also senior class president. And they were very upset about their LA being gone. And so I went up, I persuaded the high school and other people to go up and help the kids put the LA back where it belonged. I made some people really unhappy over that, but I don't know what that.
I was thinking about the accident that took you to Spain, I think it was.
Oh,
Alabama.
no, I didn't go to Spain. I wanted to go, but I didn't make that trip. Yeah.
Any other questions or closing comments before we wrap up? You know, John, again, we appreciate your time. I want to note a few other people who are here as well. Your wife, Serena, thank you for being here. Your daughter, Sue, who did so much to make this happen. Your son-in-law, Cy. Really appreciate your family. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself. As a historian, this has been a real treat. And, you know, these folks here with us today are your successors in many ways, and I think that it's been a delight for them as well. Thank you so much, John.
You're welcome.
And I guess that's a wrap.
Great. Thank you.